down so I can get them all in the,
Okay.
like
Can
people in
everybody
chairs.
can everybody sit down except for the person who's sitting here?
Yeah, I would like to frame.
Two people on the end of
Where
me?
should we go?
Just two people sitting, one and two, and then I'm gonna step out of the way, and whoever sits in the middle can go in the way.
You should actually go a little bit more to the right.
Me? Okay.
Yeah.
We're just framing.
So I think
Okay. So I'll be the Shalaka. I'll be Shalaka. Okay. I'll be Shalaka for now.
You can no sit because that's what I'm trying to do.
Ah, sorry. I think this is good. This is
Yeah.
like family photo.
We're just framing. Tell me when. Phone off. Let's do it. Ring, ring, ring. People have also ample time to come in late because this is a lengthy introduction.
How is the talk advertised? Like, do people see?
It's advertised like on the website and through social media. But it's the end of the semester, so people might be like, oh my god, I have my finals. Tell me when.
You're ready.
Hi, everyone. My name is Blair Fornwald, and I am Director Curator of the School of Art Gallery. And on behalf of the gallery, I'm so pleased to welcome you all to today's conversation between curator Shalaka Jadhav and artists Diana Sofia Lozano and Natalia Villanueva Linares. This talk is being presented in conjunction with the exhibition To Broadcast is to Scatter, curated by Shalaka Jadhav, and featuring works by both Diana and Natalia, as well as Cadence Planthara and Seth Cardinal Dodginghorse, in conversation with projects by Larissa Sansour and Søren Lind, as well as June Canedo de Souza. This exhibition is going to open tomorrow with a reception from 5 till 8 p.m. It's also going to feature a performance by Natalia at 6:30, so I hope that you can make it to that. The exhibition is going to be up in the School of Art Gallery until February 10th, and Shalaka has organized a really exciting and thoughtful roster of programming, which includes a noon-hour gallery tour that they will be hosting this Friday at noon, obviously, and a ceramics workshop by artist Cadence Planthara, who is here today, on Friday at 3:30 at Art City. So that's open to all. There's also going to be a performance by Seth Cardinal Dodginghorse at the gallery on January 25th at 7 p.m. So I really hope to see you at some of these events as well. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered here today on Treaty 1 territory. The Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene people were the original stewards of this land, and the Red River, which runs through present-day Winnipeg, is the heartland and birthplace of the Red River Métis Nation. Treaty 1 was signed here at Lower Fort Garry in 1871, and it took territory from 7 Anishinaabe and Cree First Nations to make the land available for settler use and ownership. Our water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, just about 135 kilometers away from here. The production of the aqueduct expropriated 3,000 acres of ancestral lands, including burial grounds, and forced over 100 residents to relocate. The community itself was without clean drinking water until 2021 and didn't have an all-access, all-season road until 2019. I think a really stark reminder that even in resource-rich nations like ours, these resources are not evenly distributed, and that the harms of settler colonialism are very much still with us. To Broadcast is to Scatter is an exhibition that asks us to consider our ethical relationships and responsibilities to others, and I think has really profound implications for this kind of relationship building. It looks at the ways that our mutual dependencies on other humans and other beings whose lives and futures are really deeply enmeshed with our own. All of our actions are going to be impacted by other people's actions. So this exhibition really probes the underlying systems of thought that were used to justify, and are still used to justify, extractive, exploitative, and violent activity. The show is about rethinking the ways that we organize and categorize time, hold distinctions between self and other, and separate the so-called human from the so-called natural. This is not a mere thought exercise. It's a real imperative. Our collective survival requires us to recognize our concomitants. And it's through this lens that I wish to reaffirm the gallery's commitment to working alongside Indigenous communities in a spirit of collaboration and reconciliation to create more inclusive, sustainable, and equitable spaces here at the gallery, in the university, and within broader communities. The artists in To Broadcast is to Scatter engage with these big ideas, and we're really grateful to have two of them here with us today. Diana Sofia Lozano's fantastical botanical hybrids address conditions of mutualism and hybridity in nature, critiquing the empirical and hierarchical systems of our scientific classification systems that distinguish humans from the rest of the natural world, and underscoring the ways that interspecies kinship is really necessary for our survival. Natalia Villanueva Linares' work addresses the power of resilience and transformation, extending the short lifespan of humble materials like tissue paper to create monumental and exquisite landscapes, often produced collaboratively. Along with the other artists in this exhibition, To Broadcast is to Scatter offers us opportunities to rethink how we structure and categorize time, how we might position ourselves in relation to other beings, both human and otherwise, and how we access memory and carry the past into the future. We are also extremely pleased to have curator Shalaka Jadhav with us today. Shalaka's curatorial work is informed by their training as an urban planner and their experience designing and facilitating curriculum and workshops that support young people moving toward just, climate-resilient futures. Their exhibition here is presented as part of the School of Art Gallery's Visiting Curator Program, an ambitious multi-year project which has also invited curators Grace Devaney and Lillian O'Brien Davis to the school to work together and to research, develop, and present major exhibitions, outreach programming, and publications here at the University of Manitoba. This program aims to play a vital role in defining contemporary art and its attendant discourses in the prairies, offering many opportunities for students, faculty, and community members alike to engage with curators who are charting really bold and exciting trajectories in this field. I want to thank the program's mentor, Grace Devaney, who has been really the perfect person to create this new framework with. I think we've all really benefited tremendously from her intelligence and insight, her willingness to take risks, and her generosity and kindness. The Visiting Curator Program is generously supported by Michael F.B. Nesbitt, who is a real champion in the arts throughout Winnipeg and beyond, and we are beyond grateful for his vision, support, and trust. I'm almost done. I want to acknowledge the generous support of the University of Manitoba, the School of Arts faculty and staff, our donors and volunteers who support the gallery's programming. Thank you in particular to Justin Bear for his assistance in facilitating this hybrid talk. And I would also like to thank our ASL interpreters from ECHO, Scotty and Taylor, for making this panel more accessible. I just want to note that what they're providing is a live interpretation from English to ASL and not a pre-recorded, edited translation, and that this conversation is going to be made available on YouTube, so it can be reached by a broader audience. And thank you to everyone who's on YouTube joining us today. If you are watching on YouTube and have a question, you can post it in the comments, and Justin will relay it to our speakers. So thank you again. And of course, I want to thank our three fantastic guests, Shalaka and Diana and Natalia, for their brilliant, thoughtful, and beautiful work, and for being a real pleasure to work with. I know that we're in for an engaging talk, and thank you all.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here online and in person. And thanks, Blair, for that fantastic introduction to this work. I should say, my name is Shalaka, and I've just had the immense privilege of working with really incredible artists throughout this process. And yeah, in a moment where it feels like conversation is harder and harder to come across in a way that is like dignified and incredible, I just feel really grateful, and thank you both for traveling, and I'm glad it's warming up weather-wise for you too as well. Yeah, I'm going to keep my remarks pretty short because I'm mostly just interested in sort of explaining a bit of the theory of the show, and because that's always what I'm nosy about. So I'll just get into it. Yeah. So on the screen here, you see a couple different names. I'm going to pull the screen closer. Yeah, and as Blair mentioned, I started my sort of journey career in urban planning, and it was a pretty sort of devastating direction to go into as a teenager, because I had questions around belonging and public memory after migrating to Canada at the age of 8 with my mom, and we really had to navigate how we build solidarity infrastructure, and we found that in community, which was fantastic. And so I was really curious about applying some of those observations and questions in the world of planning. But I remember pretty much my first class, we were told, we plan for land use, we don't plan for people. And just thinking about that sentence is really strange when land and people and the way that we are connected to one another is so intrinsic, and the ways in which the discipline tries to cut that connection just rings really poorly in my body. And so that's sort of when I turned to climate work as a way to sort of repair that disconnection that I was experiencing. And I trust that some of those threads have found themselves in the show as well. And yeah, curatorial work is interesting. The way that I arrived upon it was in noticing the repetition of questions around engaging publics, around just there's a lot of similarities actually in planning work and climate work and curatorial work, and I think the reason I'm drawn so much to curatorial work is because of the way it can kind of poke holes for us to think about problem solving in a different way, and imagine worlds that sometimes the world is really determined to shut off in our brains. And I think a lot of the artists do an incredible job of inviting us to open up once again. And so, yeah, part of the sort of citational practice of curatorial work, and that I want to keep up and be really explicit about, is giving credit to the people whose theorizing really grounds the show here. There are many, but the folks who are specifically cited in the show are noted on the screen here. So that includes French theorists Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, who describe the rhizome as a concept describing nonlinear networks. It's broader than that. It's a fun read. It's a messy read, but it's a fun read. As well as Astrida Neimanis, who's a cultural worker at UBC, and Rachel Lowen Walker, who's a political scientist at the University of Saskatchewan. They propose the sort of temporal framework of thick time, which is just, if by any chance you are listening out there, it's such a sick term. Thank you for putting that out in the world. And they invite us to sort of stretch between past, present, and future to think of our bodies as deep archives and interconnected with conversations on the climate. We also have Achille Mbembe, who's a Cameroonian historian and political scientist, who, in an incredible piece of work, asks us to, in the double-edged conditions of the world that we live in, what does it take to turn instruments of calculation into instruments of liberation, which is just an incredibly resonant question in this moment as well. I'm also incredibly indebted to Dr. Vanessa Watts, Indigenous sociologist, currently at McMaster, who's been thinking about the creation and maintenance of society and these frameworks from an Indigenous point of view. And I want to give particular credit to her paper, Indigenous Place, Thought, and Agency Amongst Humans and Non-Humans. First Woman and Sky Woman Go on a European World Tour. Again, sick title. And she, in this paper, argues that agency has become exclusive to humans in the ways that we've organized and designed our worlds, which has effectively removed the non-human agency out of what constitutes society. There is another duo mentioned on this slide. That's Stefano Harney and Fred Moten. I have a quote up on the screen here that I actually just have like on a post-it note in my workspace, and it's really like influenced the evolution of this exhibition. And the quote reads, "Study is what you do with other people. It's talking and walking around with other people, working, dancing, suffering, some irreducible convergence of the three, held under the name of speculative practice. The point of calling it study is to mark that the incessant and irreversible intellectuality of these activities is already present." And this quote comes from highly cited book called The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study. And in this, they generously invite us to consider the sort of self-organizing ensembles of social life in our everyday and the sort of antagonism of the undercommons. And I hope in many ways this exhibition asks us to sit with this definition of study, especially as it's situated at the University Gallery. So maybe it's really obvious, even just like from the way that I've started these remarks, but I'm not someone, this is a funny confession, I don't drive, and so it really dictates the way, it really dictates the way that I think. It's like a lot of circling and meandering, and it means that I have to tune into different stories to locate myself. And so this exhibition in many ways is inspired by different stories, and I'm just gonna share through them really quickly. So it was proposed in 2021 when I was working on a lot of fermentation projects, and that really turned my calendar from like Monday, Tuesday to let's feed the SCOBY, let's check on the starter, and invited a different sort of like timekeeping that I really started to think about. And this was also happening in parallel where I was thinking about blackouts, rolling blackouts in India. So India is where I was born, and I went every summer until I was about 16. And so what happens is because the power grid is getting overloaded, they have these rolling blackouts. And so when this happens, everyone kind of just slows down. Some people have a generator, our family didn't. And so it meant that there was a lot of story sharing, kind of just chilling in the same room. And it was maybe the first place that I practiced studying, as Stefano Harney and Fred Moten sort of note. And then again, last year in the Yukon, I was living in the Yukon, and it was a pleasure, and I was there in the summer. The Yukon is the land of the midnight sun, and so being there and watching the day stretch out over the mountains was something deeply embodied and really set me on the trajectory for this exhibition as well. And maybe the last thing I'll say is maybe just explain the title a little bit. In some ways, to broadcast is to scatter is a definition. Broadcasting refers to the sowing of seeds by casting them broadly. We also might associate broadcasting with radio, which has been fun to sort of incorporate in the programming of this exhibition. But yeah, a lot of the works in the exhibition do touch on sort of the ecological roles and responsibilities we hold, but I was also thinking about the scientific definition of scattering. I guess it's more in physics, where there's a change in direction due to like a forceful collision. And so I think we're in a really important moment of converging crises, and we need to build with one another to pull ourselves out of these patterns of destructive desire that we found ourselves in the ways that we've organized our world. And I hope that this exhibition and the works in the exhibition seed some of that potential for folks who are engaging with it. I'm gonna turn off my mic, and I'm gonna pass another mic to Diana.
This is working? Oh, great. Thank you so much, Shalaka, for having me and everyone being so kind, and this has been so fun to be here, and thanks everyone for being here. So I'll just start a little bit with some background on my practice and myself. I was born in Colombia in the early 90s. My parents were actually, at the time, two botanists who researched and focused on hybridization and genetic modification of tropical species, in kind of more in the context of commercial agriculture in that area. So I was exposed to this field of study and kind of cultivated an interest in general of plants and botany And also, I was interested in kind of the ways that plants were able to extend kind of beyond the predetermined taxonomic systems and narratives that I was learning as I was growing up. So eventually, when I started to read more about it and getting a little bit older, it did lead me to understanding botany, not just as like a science, but also an instrument of European colonial expansion. For example, as some of you might know, botanists were a big part of the European imperial kind of like project in the Americas. So they were tasked with studying and capturing and classifying plants of the quote unquote New World, and that aided into further extraction and exploitation of that region. So I'm just gonna skip ahead a little bit. One part of my practice that I kind of started like a decade ago was influenced by this ongoing event. So basically I was thinking about how the Colombian government announced peace negotiations with the FARC. And the FARC is a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla group that occupied a large part of the Colombian jungle starting in around the 50s and 60s. And the FARC started as this kind of like farmer uprising that kind of entered into this like period of like long conflict and violence in Colombia. And in around 2012, the Colombian government reached an agreement, kind of this like agreement of peace and negotiating with the group, and it became like international news. And because of that, there was this influx of American journalists that entered FARC encampments, which had never been able to be accessed before. And this is like journalism from like CNN to like Vice News, like just like, it was kind of this like hot topic at the time. And for the first time, there were these images that were coming out of this, which revealed to the world that the FARC kind of had this like really complex way of living within this like specific landscape, and also 50% of the combatants were actually women. So I became fascinated with these images, which were really prevalent at the time and around like 2012, and they really highlighted, again, the deep entanglements of the FARC members within the surrounding jungle. And in a way, these photographs were also kind of reinforcing this like voyeuristic colonial viewpoint that also rendered the flora, the landscape, and the women from the global south as kind of like toxic, dangerous, and untamable. So at first I started to think about these images, and this trajectory of investigation led me to think more about the female combatants and how they accessorize their encampments and themselves and the clothing and the uniforms and the weapons. So I was thinking about the jewelry, hair accessories, and other markers of femininity, of kind of like performing gender in this context. So this kind of led me in one way or another to thinking about these like speculative kind of human/vegetal hybrids, and in what way would these like speculative forms actually accessorize themselves as a way to perform this kind of like gendered identity that I was talking about. So I started making these sculptures that included these like oversized accessories. So this one's kind of like this like very 90s like belly button ring. And these huge accessories and these like painterly surfaces on these forms that resembled these like large tropical plants. So this is kind of like a monstera leaf with this pattern painted on top of it that kind of resembled like a camouflage pattern. And this is another example from that same exhibition and that same kind of body of work. So this is kind of like a rendering of this specific carnivorous plant that uses the smell and look of rotting flesh to deter predators and attract prey. So you can see that this is kind of these like abstracted leaves that hang from these loops and carabiners, and it also has these like silver earrings that pierce through some of the parts of the sculpture that look kind of like flesh or like colored silicone. So yeah, this is still kind of going in that vein of like accessorization, also thinking about the carabiners and kind of bringing in the aesthetic of these encampments into this work. And then just a few years later, my practice started to shift, and it shifted away from that subject matter and thinking about the FARC specifically, and it started to focus more on plants in general, and I started to think about specifically the jungle, and also how plants can inform a more non-normative way of approaching human identity and also human/non-human relationships. So here's just like a stack of books from my studio from like a few years ago that really informed my practice. I think Toulouse is on, yeah. So these books kind of delve into plants at these like super powerful loaded symbols that challenge our ideas of sentience, autonomy, gender, power. and it places the science of botany through the lens of like queer studies, disability studies, and environmental studies. So later on, the research informed these kind of like imagined sculptural forms that balance on the edges of these like various ontological contradictions. So like desirability and repulsion, beauty and monstrosity, sentience and passivity. So this piece is just an example of that. It's two floral figures that are connected at their center through like two hooked index fingers, which were cast from my actual two interlocked fingers. So maybe, yeah, you can see right in the middle. And there's still kind of a nod to like the accessorization. So there's like two dangly belly button rings that hang from the lowest petals of both flowers. So at this point, I'm still thinking about accessorization and objects related to that kind of like gender performance. And just to go into like the materials of the work, to give some context, a lot of the works that I'm going to show today have various types of like pigmented resins and silicones, as well as forged metal. And you can see a little bit of that in the sculpture kind of on the figure on the right. The metal has been heated by a torch with some help, and I'm able to braid it into these forms that create this kind of like visible armature. This piece is kind of this more abstractive flower that's standing at, it's roughly like my height. And it has these appendages that stretch as if reaching for like an embrace or like walking through a room. So something I think a lot about in the work are these botanical narratives that lean towards a kind of personification in the botanical form, but I like to lean into this trope, this kind of like human plant trope, just enough to suspend the viewer into this like false understanding of what it is, how they're supposed to relate to this subject, while at the same time is deviating from creating a sculpture that represents a specific plant or adhering to a recognizable botanical representation. So that kind of creates an ambiguity of what it is that you're looking at exactly. So I like to sit in that space of, that ambiguous space of recognition. This is a large-scale installation in which I started to incorporate mirrored surfaces. This is like 2021? Yeah, 2021. So I'm interested in the use of reflections as a way to kind of entangle and distort the likeness of the viewer within the botanical form. So this material, as much as doing that, it's also a reference to the way that specimen displays in natural history museums or museums of that sort often use mirrors to show the back of the object or the back of the specimen. So in this case, the mirror is acting almost as like an instrument of surveillance. It's capturing the space, the viewer, the sculpture, and it's distorting all of these in this kind of like, the mirror itself is kind of like warped. So it's like this idiosyncratic kind of visual grammar that also is similar to the way that the grammar of the botanical sculpture. So my goal with these reflections is to also like implicate the viewer into the act of looking. So the idea of the kind of like neutral, objective spectator or observer is an idea that's like really prevalent in natural sciences. So I'm also thinking through the mirror in a way to kind of like reject that or like subvert that. And also, of course, like the mirror is like a tool in psychoanalysis. So it references Lacan's concept of the mirror stage, the moment in which you recognize yourself as a person. And that's an example of kind of like the role of the quote unquote other in the construction of the self. So being able to like separate yourself from the other. And this kind of like breaks that apart as well. So while making this work, I was also interested in the concept of like just magnification. So thinking through like different levels of scale. The forms in the sculpture that I just showed are referencing enlarged pistils of the hibiscus plant. So this is actually not my image. This is an image, a photographic, microscopic image of pollen on a hibiscus. So these objects that you see, maybe this is better. There's these kind of like yellow spheres. So those are meant to like kind of be this like abstracted pollen spore as seen through a microscope. And yeah, just like really interested in the invention of the microscope as well, and then that kind of being, it was like at a pivotal moment in the natural sciences. It was also at the time when like kind of like these colonial quote unquote discoveries were being used as an excuse for like further European expansion, and this instrument allowed for an even deeper observation of these specimens. So in a sense, the microscope allowed for this capture of the natural world through another frontier, so the frontier of the imperceptible to the naked eye. So like, yeah, I'm like interested in these different levels of observation. And this next work kind of goes into that as well. it still continues to use mirrors as a way to like reverse the roles of the object and the subject. So this work was first installed inside a window in downtown Manhattan. And within this window, I created an environment that in a way kind of refused that photographic documentation, which is so central to kind of like commodification in botany. So what you see here is a sculptural form that's made kind of this tangle of forged metal, as I was explaining earlier, with a flower-like shape that's kind of growing out of the center. And these cut mirrors that are directly behind it, so they're like really close to the sculpture. The mirrors reflect the back of the sculpture as well as the street and kind of the changing light as well as the viewer. In this piece, something that was really great and really exciting turning point for me was that this piece was really hard to photograph. So the work no longer became this kind of passive specimen installed in kind of like a vitrine. It also like surveilled back at the viewer in the surrounding street, and it created this kind of like alternate temporality as it was always changing due to like the light conditions, the rhythm of the street, anything that was like standing in front of it. So yeah, this was like a great point in terms of like thinking about observation and thinking about what it means to look at something and to be kind of like looked back at. So moving a little bit ahead, I'm gonna just go into like the works that are in the exhibition. A few years ago, I was researching this specific kind of like interspecies reproductive process in which the bucket orchid mimics the pheromones of female pollinator bees in order to lure in the male bee inside of the flower. And once that bee is kind of like disoriented and kind of like drunk on these pheromones, the pollen sacs are then deposited onto the bee's body. So this is an image actually of the 2 pollen sacs that are attached to the pollinator bee. In this work that's actually in the exhibition, Palingenesis in the indeterminate phase, references this reproductive process, so like the orchid and the bee. And this is actually a metaphor that Deleuze also uses a lot, this like bee-orchid relationship. So with this piece, I'm thinking kind of beyond hybridity and more like investigating these moments in which boundaries between species become permeable and kind of avoid or like subvert these established dichotomies of taxonomic organization. So if you see kind of in this image, there's in the back behind the biggest piece, and you also see in the show, there's a mirror that's strategically pointed towards some sculpted text that's installed on a wall. And this is kind of an image of that text. The text is taken from a book that's on the left. And this is an instructional book on at-home orchid care. And it was actually written by my father in the 80s. And this is a translation from Spanish. So this text is in the introduction of the book. And the rest of the book is nothing like this text. It's just, this is the reason, this text, it being so different is the reason I was interested in it. So it says, orchid observation in nature in greenhouses or gardens brings forth profound feelings of admiration and ecstasy. So the text actually says profound feelings of admiration and ecstasy in the exhibition. And the text is actually written backwards, and it can be seen through the mirror in the accompanying sculpture. So I encourage everyone to try to just take a look and see. So I was thinking about the sculptural form that I showed earlier, in itself being kind of an amalgamation of these different species that are hard to specifically identify. And this abstracted kind of confusing form becomes an instrument for legibility for a phrase that itself is kind of far from any kind of empirical or objective information. In a way, it's very emotional. So this rather emotional expression comes from a person that is themselves, it seems, entangled in this kind of ecstatic relationship, even within the field of science or the observation of science in the field of botany. So this kind of like romantic affect, it might seem kind of like a rare sentiment to be included in scientific studies, but there's actually a long history of these like kind of romantic, sublime kind of expressions of flora in the background of these botanical studies. So this dates back to the Enlightenment era, in which the sciences were specifically preoccupied with this kind of emotion, but also creating systems that were able to conquer these objects to be kind of like owned or like proprietary. These like objects that inspired this like admiration were a huge impetus for European expansion. So with this piece, I'm interested in like reimagining these systems and systems of observation in order to deprioritize legibility and deprioritize identification. So shown alongside palingenesis is this drawing variable becoming. I think it's intermediate phase. And this is a color pencil drawing. It presents kind of this like non-traditional / speculative botanical illustration. So similar to palingenesis, the image is a rendering of this like interspecies relationship between the bucket orchid and the pollinator bee. The drawing is kind of this like rendering of these as I said, permeable boundaries of each being that's involved in this process. And the different acts of mimicry and identification with the other. So the drawing also has this small mirror that's attached to the lower left corner. You can kind of see there's like a little circle. And this is a nod also to the mirrors in palingenesis, but also a kind of like viewing / capture apparatus. So that kind of subverts the botanical illustration as an instrument to observe a specimen, but in this case, the specimen is surveilling back with this kind of like viewing apparatus. And this work that's also included in the exhibition continues on this exploration of permeability and hybridity, but it also focuses on a kind of like alternative vegetal temporality. So one side of the form is in full bloom and its flowers are like, they not only bear fruit, but they also transform into these like claw-like appendages that extend out and perform a kind of aliveness or sentience that's not usually associated with plants due to the fact that like a lot of their processes of reproduction and communication are imperceptible to the human eye. And they don't look like the typical processes of mammals, for example. So in contrast, the underside of the sculpture has shed all its color and kind of scattered its material onto the floor. It's as if it's settling into like the final stages of pollination, or like kind of like in this like end stage. So with this sculpture, I'm thinking of a plant form that demonstrates these two different stages in this very idiosyncratic kind of life cycle of its own. So I just want to like talk a little bit about what I'm working on right now. In my most recent work, I'm looking at these like satellite infrared mapping technologies that are used to identify and eradicate fields of illicit plants in South America. Specifically, these reports focus on coca plants, and coca plants are the plants that cocaine is made out of. So you can find some of this information online through reports that are compiled by the United Nations Office of Drug and Crime. So they're like publicly available. Some of it is publicly available, and that's what I'm looking at right now. So for context, this specific intervention is an intervention by the US, and it was something that was started and backed by the US in the early 2000s in agreement with the governments of Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia, in order to identify through like aerial surveillance these plants and also fumigate these like large swatches of land. However, there have been efforts to eradicate these plants since before the 2000s, starting back from the 80s and 90s, and this was at that time, it was done through aerial fumigation, but also land burning. So just like people actually walking around burning these like big crops. And coca has a long history in South America of medicinal practices and plays an important role in indigenous traditions. So it's an important plant beyond its use of manufacturing cocaine. So I became really interested in the criminalization of this plant. Not only does it ignore its important role in these communities, but also allows for this like large-scale fumigation and surveillance of the area. And it has proven to be very harmful to the environment and the health of the people living within these areas. So actually the fumigation ended in 2014 through these like kind of like environmental safety efforts. But there's still kind of this like big focus on how to eradicate these like illicit plants. So yeah, I became really interested in the way that these plants were surveilled in these specific reports from 2001 to 2014. And what I started doing is I started collecting all the maps that I was able to find. And they're pretty like low-res maps, but I started kind of collaging them and manipulating them into these images. So what you're seeing here is my collages of these maps that are printed onto fabric. And I started to think of plants in the context of this like aerial surveillance and speculating on how I could make sculptural forms that could appropriate these images in order to also subvert this technology. So the following slides are from an exhibition that took place in a gallery in New York City earlier this year. And this is the first exhibition that I was showing this body of work, so it's fairly recent. While doing this research and collecting all these maps, I encountered also information that was really exciting of this newly discovered strain of coca known regionally as La Millonaria or La Negra Boliviana. So this specific strain of coca has been shown to be immune to the fumigation. And it is unclear whether this is based on natural selection. Some botanists argue that it's too fast of a timeline to build immunity. But there is kind of this like local story that's sort of like kind of like scandalous, which is that drug traffickers actually hired botanists to modify this strain. But however, there's like little conclusive information about how this strain came to be, which is also just like really interesting to me. So yeah, I was really fascinated in these myths around this plant, and it became kind of like the inspiration for creating these works. And also a way to think through these concepts of like what it means to criminalize a plant, and even the racialization of the plant through its name, so like implication of its name. So by having these like kind of like speculative abstracted versions of La Millonaria, and them absorbing and appropriating the images of these maps, so like you can see here, I used the fabric to create these like floral sculptures. They became kind of a mirror in themselves of its own surveillance device, so like reflecting back its surveillance device and capturing the data and converting it in order to create its own kind of camouflage or shield, and creating its own kind of technology. And you can see here the works are also surrounded by these puddles of pigmented sand, and the material becomes somewhat simultaneously kind of this like pollen that scatters throughout the space, but it's also akin to the ash, since historically crops of illicit plants have been burned as a means to eradicate when air fumigation is not accessible or practical. And these are just like some details as well of these works. And I'm continuing to kind of work with this material and this data and finding ways to like kind of make it more legible and make it less legible. So these are more recent works from this last summer that are like wall works that also have the mirrors behind them that are also kind of incorporating this fabric, but incorporating it so much that it's almost like completely illegible. This is another recent work. And then these are works that are actually currently in my studio in progress. So you can see kind of like there's like some ends that still have wires sticking out, and I'm still kind of thinking through the material in these maps, and I feel like there's like a lot to explore there. So I'm really excited about that. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. And thank you so much. Pass it off to Natalia.
You want to sit here? Why not? We can, if it's okay with you, careful with your foot. Thank you. Wow, that was beautiful. It's beautiful to meet somebody and then to get to know so much of them a few hours later. And all there's history, right? I mean, with their work. I'm eager to see your work again now. My name is Natalia Villanueva Linares in Spanish. I am, thank you so much for having me. This is an incredible experience and a beautiful gallery. And school, of course, too. I am a French-Peruvian artist who grew up in both countries exactly the same amount of time in different phases. And as something that's very important to me is always mentioning that I have these two places of origin, because that's how my work is nourished, by two different perspectives, two different languages. Now that I live in the US, I live in Chicago now, and I've been living in the US for the past 10 years, it has added a third dimension in some way to my work, and to definitions and perspectives of materials, materiality, audience, myself, right? The place of origin of the material, of myself, and the viewer work together now as a trio. I'm gonna show you, this is the title of the work I'm presenting downstairs. It's a whole project. I'm gonna focus mainly on that project. So I am a person who call myself mostly a moment maker more than an artist. I often use the sentence moment maker because I work on very large scales, but also very minimal sizes, not minimal works. And I think that all my work is related to monumentality, but not necessarily in size, because you can find also monumentality in very, very small things. So I was very moved by what you were saying a moment ago. I work with mostly abundance and effort are ingredients of my work. And I have a relationship with certain materials that I would consider to be in some way alive or talking in some way wanting to tell their story, right? And I spend a lot of time paying attention to them. Sometimes certain materials can wait for a long time for me to work with them because I am paying attention to others. In the case of this specific material that I worked with for this project, I found it in a dollar store. So I was visiting at the time my partner in a very small city in the US named Peoria, Illinois. And I would bike around and discover the dollar store. Most of my work is very much related to effort, but also abundance and excessiveness. And there was something that was quite fascinating about going to the dollar store and discovering that for a very small amount of money, you could get 25 colorful, beautiful papers that were related to generosity, right? Tissue paper is related to gift giving, but requires generosity in two directions, the giver and the receiver, because you need to accept to receive the gift too. So that's why the whole project name is dual, because it requires two at all times, to be exchanging, to work with it, the material working with you in response. And so I discovered this material and learned by going more and more often, because I was fascinated by this store and the stores, many of them, that to me and many people around me, they will go and purchase certain things for special occasions. But for some people, it was a place for food, to look for food and to nourish their families, right, from this store. Because I would visit them more and more, I would see who was, in some way, the people, that this store was not just talking about abundance, they were also talking about scarcity, right, and the necessity for these stores to exist. And that's why it was even more evident for me that I had to work with this material. In Peru and in France, tissue papers are not used in the same manner. Growing up in Peru, we didn't have a relationship with tissue paper that much. We use wrapping paper. Wrapping paper. Tissue paper is more for very special objects, something that's treasurable or can break. So, and in France, it's the same. It was very much for very delicate objects that in some way highlight an object and make it more special, right? Something that it needs a more delicate gesture to open it. So in the US, I learned that it was just a gesture, just like taking it out of something. That was the most common one, right? And it was like a few milligrams of second just to take it out. Something that actually, if I was to count 25 papers for $1, for me it was, oh my God, I can do so much with 25 papers. Imagine if I have 10, the value in numbers, were adding up, and they made sense to integrate my life and the process of everything that I do. But something that was very important is considering that all these people would come and buy things to these stores for their families. It meant that buying 25 of them meant that they would likely use one by one for birthdays, right? One by one. Or if I have a very large family, in very special occasions, that those papers would stay inside of a drawer. I can imagine it inside of a drawer, under clothing, so nobody touches it or nobody knows for a birthday where they're located, right? So there was something very treasurable about this material, and it was one of the first materials I found in the US, and I left it next to me in a pile, waiting for me I made an artwork. As soon as I arrived, I sewed it together, put it on my ceiling, and I said, I need to keep this. And that was in 2011, which was a long time ago. And only 2 years ago, during the pandemic, we moved to Chicago from the city of Peoria, and I decided to dedicate myself fully to this project because it had so much potential. What was very powerful about this was to realize that something so delicate requires to be destroyed to become stronger. And when you make a paper ball, you're destroying in some way the fibers that exist inside of the paper, and they intertwine with each other, and they make it so strong that I can use it as if it was fabric and sew it by hand, or I can fold it and make bricks as if you were building something with them, like landscapes that you'll see in just a moment. So when I started making these large fabrics by sewing them using, in some way, I'm going to use the word palette of colors later, so I'm just an amount of colors that was appealing to me, that would be picked in the same way as you're thinking of, I'm thinking of color not only about what you wear and what you see and what surrounds you, but also colors are textures, right? Certain things that you would pick because you want to wear that, the texture, and how pleasant it feels to have it around, or how evident it is that it represents how I feel today, right? And you have it on you. So also as a sensation, that's how I usually pick the colors. And I made these large fabrics, and as I was making them, the amount of time that it takes to take a paper, make a paper ball, open it again to prepare it, and then having 100 times these gestures done, was very, it revealed that it needed more, in some way, every single part of existence of this process needed time of celebration and time of cultivation too. So I mostly work with installation works and sometimes performance, often performance, but the performance has always been, up until this artwork, related to inviting others to discover actions, gestures that are in my work that I need to multiply 1,000,000 times or distribute and offer to others because they're incredible. Like, they're mind-blowing to me, so I have to, everybody should feel this because it's so incredible. And I create large performances with 40, hopefully 50 one day or more, where every single person has the same object, and I give one specific instruction on how to transform it, and they all do it at the same time. So those moments are very, as an experience that is auditory, it's pretty phenomenal, because it feels like the sound of what they're making touches anything around them, as if it was a ripple of sound that's embracing us and enveloping us. And I think that because the performance and the installation used to be very separated, this project allowed me to, in some way, integrate people in every single stage of process of transformation. And in the making, in the sewing, not yet, but it's coming. In the sewing in the future, in the folding, and then in the unmaking. So that's what I'm gonna, this is the dual number 8, and each number that I use is the type of colors, right? The amount of colors that are related to this one, but it means that every single time I use all these colors together, I can make fold bricks related to it. All the performance around it will have that number, but the number is indicative of that specific, not specifically the fabric, but the colors that will be around this process. And there's another one in the back, has another number, but I would not be able to remember right now. This is dual 8, which was made last year. This was dual 6, that was made in 2020 during the pandemic. And I don't know if you see that it's missing. Do you see that it's missing one square there? And it's because I see them as, in the past I used to work with them as if they were unique formulas, right? There's 81 minus 1, so calculate in some way. This fabric was done, it's the 81 units of time minus 1, and the 1, we cannot see it in the image, but it's in a very small box of acrylic box. It's waiting there. But something that's really beautiful when you see that unit on the side is that you can see where it used to be in the fabric, because it still has the lines of the golden thread. So they're all sewn using gold thread, because the material is meant to, in some way, disappear after a very small amount of time, to lose its colors and wilt. So one of the duals I'm working on is to take it in the sun as many times as possible until it loses all its colors. But you'll see in the exhibition, the dual that's downstairs, dual 11, started 3 years ago, and you will be able to find some of the papers that I had in my studio for 3 years that have been wilting. And because they wilt, they have many more colors, right? The ones from before, the ones from now, and hopefully it will keep in some way disappearing, right? And that's why the gold thread, so at the end the only thing that would be left is the gestures, right? The texture of time that it takes to make them, and the time that it takes to sew them together. So that's when I decided to, in some way, cut in this unit. I was like, I needed to invite other persons to experience those moments of feeling that thread in some way in between your fingers, and seeing that each unit is connected, related, and almost located, you know, in each part of the fabric, because you can, if you extract one, it will still have pieces of the others. And so I've been doing, this is dual 8 from the first and dual 6 after, and I invited persons to come with me and to redistribute the time that it took to make it. So the whole is redistributed by many, and we cut at the same time, which is really beautiful because I'm so accustomed to make these, it becomes very instinctive for me to work with something, right? You take a very long time to work with something, and then it's part of you, right? It's written now inside of you. And when I'm participating, it's powerful to see other performers take their time, because they're following they understand in some way the effort that I took to make it, and they're returning its respect. So you can see me sometimes in the performances going too fast, and everybody else is just at the same time, just slowly going inside, which is really beautiful to see also when you share with other people, how other people nourish your work, and they belong to it, you know, or it makes them, they add of their time, but it means of their sensibility also, right, to the process. So their generosity, their effort is part now of the work. So when it's cut, then each paper is sunk in water, one by one, each unit is sunk in water. It's me, in that photograph there's another person, we were 4 performers, and in this one it was just me, but something important was that the 2 previous ones were made 2 years later, so they don't need to, each form of existence of this work doesn't depend on the other. They can exist independently from the others. I just know that they're part of a very large process of, in some way, stages, states of becoming, right? You have one form and then you have another, but each one is independent of each other and carrying the history of what happened to them, but also what's going to happen to them later. So each one of the papers go in water, and with a mold, I make a small palette. So that's when the monumentality, the large scale of something that's very large, becomes quite small, and they become little tiny little bricks. I don't know if you can see it from where you're sitting right now, but in this one, when we have these palettes in our hands, we can see the gold thread inside of them. And it's really beautiful to see them shining, because in some way it calls you. You can see and understand the color, but when you get close, it shines a little bit with the lights around us. So in this stage, there is something that I would like to the reason, a goal for them to become a palette. Palette is one part of its life, because one of the next steps that I'm working on is dust. So they're going to be dusted, right, after each one individually. Not this one specific, right, because I'm working, maybe. It would depend on how I want to continue to pursue all this process. But it would be also to dust each one of these small bricks. But somebody told me, oh, and then it's over. There it is. You dust it. And it's like, no. There is also the, you know, le souffle. How do you say the souffle? Yeah. Breathing, let it, you know. It's a question of distribution, distributing something so much. I grew up with that idea of nebula, right? A nebula. And the person who introduced me to Deleuze, by the way, is the person who told me, I thought that, because I grew up just with this idea without making any research about it, that when a nebula would happen, right, as the star becomes a nebula, that, you know, they would fly, you know, they would continue together. And my friend who studied philosophy, and he's an incredible human, told me that they could become a star again, but with parts of another nebula. And that blew my mind. Because I think that that's what, in some way, gives stages of transformation to your own work. Not only this one, because I work on many different things at the same time. And one of the collections that I'm working on about this is to extract a color of the whole. So while I'm making these palettes, each one of them is extracting a color. Some of them don't extract color, but just because they're coming in, I know that they're participating, right? We know that they're participating. We know they're leaving a little bit of their spirit in it. So this is the color that I have that was extracted from dual 8, and this is the one from dual 6. something that I started doing because the paper was so strong and capable, I mentioned the bricks a moment ago, is landscapes. I call them lands, lands of dual 11. So this is part of the piece that is exhibited, a very small part. And these landscapes, not all of them, but my hope is that they give us this architectural landscape that makes us think of a city or a village. So now if you consider that I'm going to put them in water later, it's because they're meant to disappear, right? But when they disappear and they go into water, what is really powerful is that then they become a color. Then they become also a brick, which is much stronger, and you can build something from them, right? So it isn't disappearing. It makes me think of civilizations, this idea of civilizations and how so many places, lands have been destroyed or hurt, or but how from there can we build things or create something much stronger. It is very much written in this work, and I appreciate very much how, not really looking for it, but how an architectural sensation has entered, right, the whole process. And actually I discovered I'm going to talk about amounts of time, because when I was mentioning the milligrams of seconds, right, all this process was so long, and I can see what it's going to become in the future, but something that, long in the sense of like a long story, right? A long story that has many different chapters, and I'm going to explore each one of them. But then, this is Nova Scotia, by the way. And I decided to just add an amount of time to each one of the papers, and it was more than enough. It was almost like just the whole beginning of everything, where there is all these process that can happen, but actually when I just add an amount of time, it already has a little piece of me, right? Or you, or anyone who takes the time to just make a paper ball and open it again. Because when you open it, you can see in some way what has happened to the paper, right? What have you done to the paper? And so that's when I decided to, this was actually my first palette that I made, and I started to put them in the water. After this photograph, just by the way, I started using the bucket because I realized that the color was going it's the ocean, what's there, and I was very uncomfortable after this moment. But it's the first mistake. And when I was putting them in the water, it was really revealing of a place of origin, to know that they came from an ocean in Nova Scotia. So they had a birthplace, right? A place of origin. So then that's when water started to has always been very important. But this time it was how the water also gives a location, a place. If you get close to these palettes and you come to my studio one day, you can see that they have leaves, right? Or little dirt or little stones that were inside of the water when I was making them. And these two, we can really see it. It was the pandemic and we were trapped, so that's how I had to just use jars or anything I had around to keep them around. And when making them, that's when they created the colors, but it was just it wasn't palettes of dual number something, it was palettes of gestures, right? It's just only in plain palette of gesture. So then I decided to use also the ocean that's in Peru. But this pile that I have in my hands, actually, it was during a performance we did. I don't know if you've been to Paris. There is a Pompidou, the museum that has the tubes and the colors, for those who just remember spaces and colors. And so these were made, they were in some way, the participants added their time, took it in my backpack to Peru a week later, and I transformed it in the palette of color of gestures in Peru by the ocean, Pacific Ocean. And when you get close to it, you can see that the bucket is full with the color, right, of all of them together. So it isn't the time that I spent making them, but also all the participants that were there before. So we are adding to the material and to these little bricks, or each part of it, history, right, their own, or memories, right? They're made of different memories. And also, as a person who has traveled all my life, I'm very moved in some way by this project, because they carry also different forms of places of origin, right? Like when you stay for a very long time somewhere, they become also a place that originates who you are. So I add places of origin to each part of the transformations. So this one is one of my favorites. It was made in Chicago. It was a very, very cold winter in 2020. And we had, that's a massive mountain of snow. Massive, massive mountain of snow. And I decided to put the papers and the gestures in the snow, and it stained the area around it. So I took that and put it inside in my studio on the floor. My partner is Canadian, so when he came inside of the studio, I was like, "What are you doing with snowballs on the floor?" Because culturally speaking, you all have been dedicated to not bring the snowballs inside, which is really beautiful that I have to some way translate that to people to understand how important it is to not do this here, and how important it was to put it in a jar. And when they melted, they made the color on their own. So this is a color, but the color is the snowballs, right? Now it's completely done. So this is the collection of colors, part of the collection of colors that I have done up until now. And what is really beautiful is that with this collection of colors, and some of them are from duals number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 until 11, not 11 yet, nor 10 either, or palettes of gestures. But now what I'm doing is this: staining paper, staining tissue paper. So when I stain the tissue paper now, what it's really, what I'm looking for is to, in some way, I am able now to create the same from the whole previous installation, just by getting into water, putting inside of the color, extract them, dry them. They dry very quickly because it's tissue paper, and now create large fabrics or also little bricks, repeating the story but on the other side, right? And this is the last part. I was gonna say it's my favorite, but they're all my favorite. Poematics, the word is related to poem and mathematics, kind of just in the middle. It can be written, if you see me in the future reading with Q, with a K or Q or a slash, they all count because it's a trilingual word, and it changes as much as I want. So I have 2 guide in some way performers, which I couldn't do at this time because we're doing for the first time a new performance I've never done before, and I haven't yet done the poematics for that. I've created a system of symbols to be able to symbolize the gestures and guide the performers to how we're going to transform the material. The small square on the beginning is when you receive the paper. Then you are to open the paper. Sorry, we're going on that one. Then the circle is you make a paper ball, and then you open it again. But when you open it, now it's full with color, right? The time that you added to it. And each one goes into water. The colors of water also depend on if it's rainwater, it has a type of blue. If it's ocean water, it has a type of blue. And then it makes, you make a palette you make a brick from each one of them. This was my first ones. There are more stages now that I need to develop. And this one is just to make a pile of them, right? You have the paper, you open, you make a paper ball, you open it again, and you pile it up in order of colors. This one actually was the drawing we used to make the performance that I brought to Peru. That's what I showed to them. So these, I use them as partition, and in time they have these, because of my certain subtle mistakes that I make when I draw them, they look like music already. They have a musicality about them. So that's when I started working on this, which is Poematics XL. They're very large, up until now done in craft paper. They're super large. This is the largest one that I did last week. This is much longer. But I make the drawing, and then I cut around, and it kind of looks like giving a space for, I don't know, like an aura, right? Like a spirit of each line or each one of the symbols. But it looks like an object that could go into an imaginary gigantic music box, where if you turn it, it creates sound, right? So that's why I kept that in mind. This is a very large one, but I was like, wait, music box, and it goes somewhere. It goes inside of the machine, right? So that's when I started making this first one, where it's very long, and it has, in some way, the whole story and every stage of transformation that could take one piece that you see in front, you have before your eyes. And so this one is kind of a poematic of the last one. This is the one, this is my last work that is presented right now at the Ball Art Museum in Chicago, and it's dual 10. And it's the first time that I presented the fabric related to a lens, right? Lens of dual at the same time. And my hope, maybe not during that exhibition, but it would be to create a color from the whole, right? But it doesn't mean that I can't work with these colors together anymore. I can continue on working with dual 10 in different forms. There you go. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I think this is kind of the part of the show program conversation where we turn it over to you. Maybe, yeah, I'll just note that there's a mic, so if you want to go up to the mic and ask a question. And Justin, I'm not sure if there's any questions online. Not yet. Okay, so we can maybe, if anyone has any questions bursting, please feel free to ask. But also...
Oh, are we on? I think this is, oh, there we go. Yeah, now we're on. Oh my gosh. I think I have a question for probably each of you, but I was thinking a lot, because you've both got me into like a Deleuzian kind of place where like the questions multiply. But I guess I'm thinking a lot about like gift theory in relation to your work, Natalia, and I don't know if that kind of informs some of your practice, like the way that Derrida or Emmanuel Levinas kind of articulate the gift as kind of like this impossibility where like what you're creating is like a sense of kind of mutual obligation to one another. So when you give a gift, you are also kind of expecting something back. And the way that your work kind of builds those relationships or kind of troubles or carries them to like the next degree. Is that a question? I'm also wondering about the life that the tissue paper had beforehand, because I think what you're sort of setting up is like a bit of a factory production system, but it's a factory of like sort of affect and pleasure and like sort of sensory experience for the participant and for yourself. But I'm also thinking about the conditions that produced the work as well, and how you're kind of honoring like that legacy.
Thank you so much. I'm going to respond for the giving first. The gifting, something that when I speak of generosity, because I find that certain objects have the potential to offering us more or to tell us their story in some way. But it doesn't make any sense to tell the story if there isn't anybody to read it, right? I mean, I like the idea. Even if an artist just never tells anybody that they bury everything that they make every single time, if we never hear about it, then it doesn't necessarily participate, right? So the participation in some way of a work and the maker, right? Or making a viewer a maker is part, not necessarily on purpose of my work. I think it's just a mirroring of my, potentially my personality, but also of how I function, how I was brought up to function, or how I function as a person, but also how effort is, again, an ingredient. I repeat it because I said earlier about my work, where effort is something that I have noticed that we have in common, that we understand, and all ages understand. There are certain artworks that I've put in hands of people, and not this one, but others, that I put in hands of people, and I say where it is, and people, the same reaction is physically evident for everybody. And effort, I feel that, sweating, because it's so natural, right? Not for everybody, but it can happen, just to sweat or to feel tired, right? Effort is a connector of, for me, generosity. So it has, because there is so much abundance, it almost immediately connects to effort. So then we get close. So then when we get close, your generosity physically, turns on, because you're giving time to the object too. So I think that that's the gifting part. It's the object is receiving the gift of your time also, right?
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful. And it's kind of honoring the labor that kind of went into the making of the tissue paper in the first place by kind of extending its life. Like it feels like a generous act that kind of honors the like sort of just the existence of that paper and
Yes.
the sort of like work and materials that kind of like went into it in the first place. I think it's really beautiful.
When inviting people to participate on the first part, right, for the previous life of the material that I don't necessarily show because I've done it very few times. This is a very long project, so I haven't yet explored all of them, but it's really beautiful because people understand that there's many that are asked to do it at the same time, and we feel less fear when we're accompanied by others.
Mm-hmm.
And when you make sound, it's very, I don't know, it's almost as you don't need to talk anymore because the material is speaking for you, so you know you're participating.
Right.
So that's what in some way connects the participants in general.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
I'll ask another one of Diana. Unless, are there questions? Oh, get it.
I have a question, but I'm mic shy. Oh, if that's okay, can you hear me? Or should I?
On the internet.
Okay, I'll just do it.
Yeah, just do it.
Hi, thank you. That was an amazing talk. Yeah, I don't know if I zoned out for a second, but does the paper at some point, the tissue paper, become fabric? And then I was wondering, like, what is the difference between paper and fabric?
That's a beautiful question. I use it as if it was fabric. And I think that I hope you'll get to see it in the show too. Something that's really beautiful is to see that it seems like fabric from afar. And the hand stitching and certain details in the work feel like fabric. And many people have a hard time believing in it until they touch it, because it also feels like silk. People who know of fabric know of silk and its delicacy, right? So there's certain that no. I have a conversation with people who are fighting really hard. It is silk, like, touch it, please just touch it. Because it also elevates, right? Silk is one of the most precious fabrics that exist in the world, and somebody fighting really hard, it is, which means that something so simple can give you such a strong sensation of fabric. I haven't yet worked on the fabric making. I think just sewing it, for me, elevates it to a fabric, sensation. Yes. I'm Peruvian, that's my, I'm Peruvian. It's a very, sewing and using fabrics are very common in certain cultures, but there is something that, the simplicity of the material, right? The too simple of the material doesn't even feel like it could be real until you have it in your hands. Make a paper ball, open a tissue paper, you'll see that you don't need to consider fabric because it is already,
I had a question, actually, for the first artist. I didn't catch your name. I'm sorry. Diana. Hi, well, that's easy enough. Diana. In one of your works, I noticed that some of the material you used was a fragrance oil. And I just wondered how you used it in the piece, or the reasoning in that particular piece that it was used.
Yeah, so that installation is the only time that I've used fragrance, and it's actually like, it was really difficult. Like, it was something that I was like testing out. That was also like this like big installation where I was trying out a lot of different things. But because I was introducing the mirrors in that work as well, there was kind of this moment where I was like, what's gonna happen with like these different, how can I like engage like different kinds of senses? So it was an experiment in which so that work had a lot of wool, which is something that I do use pretty frequently now. And what I was doing when I was processing the wood, because I get this like raw wool and I am like dyeing it and I'm cleaning it and processing it, is I ended up like dipping it in these like different essential oils, and like some of them were synthetic and some of them were like more like organic, kind of like I was like doing all this like weird alchemy to kind of just like experiment to see what would happen. And it was something that came up a lot when I was in grad school, where it was like, what's happening with like smells? Because like there's so much of like smell and memory in terms of like, you smell a gardenia and you're like immediately like, oh, that's gardenia. And it was interesting. It ended up being something that was more interesting in terms of like when people were talking to me about that piece, where it was 2021, so a lot of people were experiencing it in this place where there was like a lot of social distancing and masking, and some people didn't smell it at all, and some said that it had followed them through the whole gallery. So it was interesting too in terms of like thinking through the pheromones in this work that is showing in this gallery, because I was thinking about that specific relationship and thinking about something that like the way that like some of the sand in that work too was like dragging in people's shoes, so it was like going outside of the building, the way that the smell kind of followed people as well. And I want to experiment more with smell, but I think I want to get to a point where I collaborate with someone that really knows a lot about smell, because I think that was something that I was like, let me think about this a little bit more. But I think when I'm making things, I'm such a like I'm like fidgeting with a lot of things, and I'm such a maximalist that I end up just like, I throw it in there, and then eventually I kind of like forgot it was there. Like it was like, yeah, but when I unpack that piece, sometimes it's like, it all comes back to me. Yeah, but I'm interested in thinking about it more.
What are the two names of the scent, like your alchemy scents? Because they have names.
Oh yeah, there was one Bermuda Triangle, and there was garden soil. Yeah.
We can let you imagine what those are like. You don't have to get into
Yeah,
it.
Bermuda Triangle is wild. Yeah.
One's so common and one's so imaginary and one's so familiar.
Yeah.
Everyone's so tall, man. All right. Thank you. It's reassuring that there's a bunch of us. Speaking of scale, great segue. Actually, I'm going to start with a comment, not to be that person, and then a question. One is what you guys were talking about earlier brought to mind just a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer in Braiding Sweetgrass, which is, "We are all bound in a covenant of reciprocity," and that's something that seems to have come through in all of your works, which I thought was really neat. But as all of you spoke, I also was thinking a lot about Timothy Morton and object-oriented ontology, and especially hyperobjects, right? And as you all like engage conceptually, temporally, spatially with questions of scale, I just wanted to ask how each of you in all of your art, because curating is also an artistic practice, how you make decisions about scale, whether it's in terms of the materials that you use and, you know, their origin and their afterlife, which I know for one of you is definitely always an active question, but also, you know, the practicality of working within a space, or of trying to map out how your work will reflect the concepts and work that you've done to engage and inform your practice. So I know that's kind of a big one, but I'm just going to throw that at you and then run away.
Okay, I can start. And yeah, true to what I said earlier, like I tell stories as a way to get to the point, so I'll tell a story now. I think almost in every studio visit, I sort of mentioned the story where I wanted the feeling of the exhibition to feel like you were taking a walk in the forest and you came upon a big tree or a big like root that is like exposed from the ground, or just like this moment of like deep time, like this moment that is like so much bigger than your lifetime might be. And you just pause, like there's no like phone to capture the moment. You just like, you're kind of held by that feeling and that place, and the scale of it all, because those, again, like as someone who doesn't drive and walks a lot, like I'm I think like tuned into things in a different speed. And so one of the ways that it's kind of reflected in the show is Diana's works sort of greet you into the space. And it's designed as a sort of like, it's not like a clear path to the back of the gallery. And so I was thinking about ways to like replicate those moments of scale in the space. And I think just like the storytelling from the studio visit and like the emails we've exchanged as well is just, I felt like was a really nice way to connect those moments together. So that's like one example maybe of how I was thinking of scale and like experience and like movement. I also realized in Winnipeg, we don't use salt to like melt the snow because it doesn't work, I think, at a certain temperature and it gets quite cold here. So there's a lot of sand, and there's like sand boxes, right, all over the city. And so I'm curious, since this exhibition runs through the winter, how the materiality of sand and hopefully there being more snow will like kind of interact with one another. Like in that moment that you were talking about pollen being tracked through the other exhibition, there might be like a new sand intervention kind of accidentally, and I'm kind of curious about that, like the edge of that relationship. And I'm not sure why your question brought that up for me, but I was just thinking about it. So yeah, thanks.
I can quickly. For me, I think that there is a sensation of protection, something that can protect you, and enveloping. I think those are two things but I think that those sensations vary for every person, because some people and some days we feel that something that can be protective is something that we pay close attention to by going, putting our bodies over and taking off everything that is around us. So it can be something very small that has the same enveloping and protective sensation, but others are more like an embrace. When we were talking about the flower receiving, I was thinking, I want to see that one. And how in some ways welcoming also at the same time, but it has to be also mindful of where it is, where it's going to happen, who is coming, and the path, right, to get to that sensation. That's how scale works for me.
Yeah, I really like to think about scale, because there's, for one, I'm like making these like bigger works in which there's kind of this like confrontation with the work that's in front of you, like sculpturally. You're just like, this thing is like almost my size, if not bigger, and it's like taking up an amount of space, and in a way you're kind of like negotiating space with that work. But also I think about the way that I'm thinking of moments in which you kind of are fitting the role of a specific kind of organism or being that wouldn't be your scale otherwise. So thinking about like that big installation with the smell where you're like kind of entering this space, and because it's like based on this like microscopic image, in a way you're kind of like either shrinking or the thing you're looking at is expanding. So there's kind of this confusion of scale as well. And also I do have a lot of like reference material of plants, but it's rare that I like only focus on like one, like replicating one kind of thing. But what I usually look at is these different kind of like images of plants, whether there's just like one part of the plant, so these like different sections, and then I like kind of just think about that, or I think about like the smallest part of that plant and like blowing it up, so it's just kind of exploring that part even further. So I think about scale in that way a lot. Like I make the things that are small big, and the things that are big small. Basically is like the simplest way to put it. But then right now I'm thinking about scale differently in the way that I'm thinking of these maps as this kind of like aerial, this like large kind of like God's eye view viewpoint of these like big crops, and then it's like this area that's really dense and really hard to navigate by foot. So like I'm thinking of these ways that it's like absorbing this like big amount of information into these like this like sculpture that's like in a way mimicking these like small kind of like objects and these like small organisms, and then in a way to kind of like just like minimize the importance of this like huge survey of something. It's like the huge survey of something is actually just flying out a landscape. And also one thing that I'm like, I'm really thinking about, as soon as I have time in the studio to try new things, I want to like make miniatures. Like I just want to make like tiny things now. I think I'm like kind of over the big sculpture thing. I like go back and forth. Yeah. So right now I'm kind of like focusing more on like really small details. So those works in progress in the studio, I don't have pictures of them, but it's like there's parts where it's like this tiny detail in like one section. So yeah, I love thinking about scale. Yeah.
Is there a question online? There is. I think we've got time for maybe like one more, and then we'll have to.
Hello. So we have a question from Suzanne. I am inspired by this to create performance/ceremony to connect people without words. Can Natalia comment further on the power of that and how she discovered it? As a writer, I find it compelling.
Thank you for the beautiful question. I think that when practicing performance, I personally do it in a very private and intimate manner because it's very meaningful for me. I'm a very sociable person, and I don't see that as a compliment. I've done that several times, because when I arrive somewhere and there are 50 people, my insights can divide into 50, and the excitement to discover 50 humans, and all the energy goes out and doesn't necessarily return. So I think that in my performance practice, I was very personal, intimate. I was making potions to where I invite only the persons related to the sentiment or the materials or the ingredients in some way. I was making undrinkable potions to heal time and distance, and which are not meant to be healed, of course, but by making them, there were certain gestures inside of this process that were extremely powerful. And it wasn't only because I didn't know they were going to do that to me. I think that they find you, these gestures or moments that you think that they should accompany you or they should be given or shared with other people. They find you if you pay attention. And in these they were very long, these performances. They can take 2 hours, 2 hours and a half. And the process of making them made me think about time and distance, and it felt as if they were, for that amount of time, healed. It's like, oh, I made it. But then that performance is over, and that sensation is over too. So it was inside of these processes that I found these gestures that, to me, needed to participate or being offered to others. But because my work is related to multiples, it started with a small amount of persons, very dear friends of mine first, offering them to live these experiences, and then having 10 persons doing in a sense doing the same thing. It was really it awakened my curiosity to think, what would it be to multiply it even more, and many more people receiving or creating this moment at the same time. So I think that what creates, in some way, power in that moment is that all these people don't necessarily know each other, and they are related now because of that experience of living together forever. And it is really, I have never participated in the large performances, and I am never going to, because I don't think that I need to. That's inside of it. I create that barrier, right? Like I've sacrificed because it isn't about my work in those performances, not the ones related to dual, because those are different. But in these performances where many people are participating, I am not. I think that it is really beautiful to see a person who care for art, experience arts, knows about art, have never known anything about it, was just walking by, doesn't care about art, feeling that they can become what we call an art piece, right, for 20 minutes. Because it lasts around 20 to 25 minutes, but you feel that you're participating in some way in the life of others that are around you, but also in the life of art history, right? And you can continue in some way practicing this around you. So I think that that's what I have seen, and the participants then come and murmur what happened to them. So it isn't only what I experience, it's also what the participants feel, tell, and in some way nourish, right, the work with their own story, right? It belongs then to those who participated.
Thank you so much to all of our beautiful speakers, and to all of you who asked such really thoughtful questions. And thank you, Shalaka, for bringing this gorgeous exhibition together. And I expect that all of your curiosities are now wet, and you will wet with an H, and that you'll all be coming to the reception tomorrow evening at 5 o'clock. You can witness the Landscapes of Dual 11 performance, and you can see this exhibition, which I think is really profound and kind of mind-bending and beautiful, and also just like really kind of like deeply felt, phenomenologically felt. So it's going to be really exciting. We also have a variety of of beautiful fermented local foods to sort of honor the cycles of rot and regeneration and canning and preserving and caring for that. So come for that. Come for it all. Okay, thank you. Take care.